They say every person fights a war the world will never see. But what if that war isn't out there? What if it's inside you? The voice that tells you you're not enough. The silence that grows louder each time you ignore it. The smile you wear that hides everything you don't want to face. Most people think they'll break from pressure, from failure, from loss. But the truth is, we don't break because of what happens to us. We break because of what we tell ourselves about it, the stories we repeat until they become prisons. There was a time I thought my mind was my enemy, until I realized it was just a mirror reflecting what I refused to heal. So let me ask you this. What if the pain you're running from is the very thing trying to save you? What if you've never been broken, only buried beneath your own doubt? Stay with me, because once you see what's been hidden beneath your thoughts, you'll never see yourself the same way again. There was a morning I'll never forget. I woke up and felt like something inside me had quietly died overnight. The world outside looked the same sky, the same walls, the same routine, but I wasn't the same. I felt hollow, like I'd lost something I couldn't name. I remember sitting on the edge of my bed, staring at the floor. I wondered if this was what it meant to break, not loudly, but silently, invisibly. The strange thing was no one noticed. I smiled through it, went to work, did what was expected, but inside, I was falling apart. That was the day I realized the most dangerous kind of suffering is the one no one can see. For years, I thought I understood strength. I believed it meant endurance, to keep going, to hold everything in, to survive. But what I didn't understand then was that survival and living are not the same thing. You can survive a life you're not even present in. You can look awake and still be asleep inside. I lived like that, trapped behind invisible glass, screaming in silence. Every day was a repetition of the last. Every thought a reminder of what I wasn't. I told myself I was fine, that I was just tired, that everyone felt this way. But deep down I knew I wasn't living. I was waiting for something to change, waiting for permission to start again. One night, everything cracked. There wasn't a grand disaster, just a sudden realization. I had spent my entire life trying to control things that were never mine to control. People's opinions, outcomes, time. The past, the future. I was exhausted from playing God in a universe that never listened. I had mistaken control for safety, and it was killing me slowly. That night, I sat in the dark, completely still. For the first time, I didn't fight the silence. I listened to it. And somewhere within that quiet, a voice whispered, not loud, but clear, "Let go." That's when it began, not a breakdown, but a breakthrough. I started noticing how much of my suffering came from my own resistance. The more I clung, the more I bled. The more I tried to force life to bend to my will, the more it broke me. But when I began to surrender, to truly accept what I could not control, something shifted. The fear didn't disappear, it transformed. I realized that maybe freedom isn't found in control, but in trust. Trust in life, trust in time, trust in myself. Looking back, that was the first step toward awakening, a death that wasn't the end, but a rebirth in disguise. You don't realize how asleep you've been until the moment you wake up. You don't realize how heavy the world has been until you finally put it down. Every thought, every worry, every false identity you've carried, gone. And what remains is terrifying and beautiful. Stillness. Not the absence of movement, but the presence of awareness. If you're listening to this, and something inside you stirs, a quiet ache, a question you can't ignore, that's not coincidence. It's your soul calling you to remember, to stop running, to come home. This story isn't just mine, it's yours too. Because at some point, we all have to face that moment. The moment where the life we've been living no longer fits who we are becoming. That's not the end of your story. That's the beginning of a new one. So before we continue, I want to ask you for one thing. If this message resonates, take a second to subscribe. Not for numbers, not for vanity, but because this space exists for people like you, people who are ready to rise. Every story, every word that follows, is a piece of that journey. Your support keeps it alive. Now let me leave you with a question, one that might stay with you longer than you expect. If life asked you to choose right now, A, to keep chasing control, fighting every wave, clinging to the illusion of certainty. B, to surrender, to trust the unknown, to let go and see where life leads. Which would you choose, A or B? Comment your answer below. There's no judgment, only reflection. Sometimes, the act of choosing is where your transformation truly begins. The war no one sees is the one that kills the most quietly. For years, I lived in that invisible battlefield, not fighting others but myself. Every morning, I woke to the sound of a voice in my head whispering defeat before the day had even begun. It said I wasn't enough, that I'd fail again, that everyone else had it figured out, except me. I didn't know then that this voice wasn't truth, it was programming, the echo of every criticism and rejection I had internalized. It disguised itself as reason, as protection, as honesty. But in reality, it was the enemy wearing my face. I tried everything to silence it. Work harder. Achieve more. Prove my worth through performance. But the louder the world applauded, the louder the voice became. That's the cruel paradox. The more you seek validation, the emptier you feel when it arrives. Because it never satisfies the part of you that doubts your own value. It only feeds the hunger of the voice that says you'll never be enough. One day, I realized something terrifying. I wasn't living. I was surviving my own thoughts. Each one a small blade cutting deeper into my self-trust. The Stoics called this the discipline of ascent, the ability to control which thoughts you allow to define your reality. I had never learned it. My mind was a house left unlocked, and anything could walk in. Fear, insecurity, regret, all of them lived rent-free in my head. It wasn't until I sat in silence, really sat with myself, that I began to see the truth. The voice that I thought was mine wasn't mine at all. It belonged to the past, to the people who had projected their pain onto me, to a culture that equated worth with productivity, to a version of myself that thought suffering was a sign of depth. It was then that I began the slow work of separating who I was from what I thought. That process was brutal. It meant questioning every belief I had about myself. It meant asking where it came from, who it served, and why I still obeyed it. Some nights it felt like peeling my own skin, realizing that most of what I believed wasn't truth, just habit. I remember reading Marcus Aurelius, his words like a calm fire. The soul becomes dyed with the color of its thoughts. I started to understand, if I kept feeding myself poison, it was no wonder my spirit was sick. So I began to observe instead of react, to watch thoughts pass like clouds instead of storms. I practiced saying, I am noticing the thought that I am not enough, instead of I am not enough. That tiny distance between thought and identity became everything. It was air. It was freedom. It was peace. The inner war never truly ends. You don't win it once and move on. You learn to recognize its patterns, to disarm it with awareness. You learn that the mind can be both your greatest ally and your most convincing enemy. And when you master that distinction, you no longer need to silence the noise, because you've remembered that you are not the noise. You are the one listening. And that realization changes everything. There are moments when words save you, not because they're magic, but because they name what you've always felt but never understood. That's what happened when I began writing down truths, small fragments of wisdom that anchored me when everything else spun out of control. They weren't revelations. They were reminders, things I had always known deep down but had forgotten in the chaos of survival. The first truth was simple. My thoughts are not facts. For most of my life, I treated every passing idea as gospel. If my mind said I was worthless, I believed it. If it said I'd fail, I prepared for failure. But thoughts are not evidence. They're weather patterns, storms and sunshine, none of them permanent. The Stoics knew this centuries ago, that perception is the birthplace of suffering. We suffer more often in imagination than in reality, Seneca said. And I finally understood how right he was. The second truth, the voice of my inner critic is not mine. It took years to recognize how much of my self-talk was borrowed. The tone of disappointment from a parent, the mockery from a teacher, the subtle cruelty of someone I once loved. I carried their voices like relics, believing they were truth when they were only echoes. Replacing that inner dialogue became a daily discipline, not with empty affirmations, but with compassion. Every time I made a mistake, I tried saying, "I'm learning," instead of "I'm hopeless." It felt unnatural at first, but slowly, the ground shifted. The third truth, comparison is poison. I spent years measuring my worth with someone else's ruler, looking at what others had and concluding I was behind. But comparison is never fair. You're comparing your behind the scenes to someone else's highlight reel. The Stoics practiced gratitude not as a ritual but as a survival tool. Each morning, I began to list what was still right in my life, however small. Gratitude doesn't erase pain, but it changes the lens through which you see it. The fourth truth, mistakes do not define me. I used to replay every failure like a film I couldn't turn off. But shame, I realized, is the anchor that keeps you chained to the past. Guilt says, I did something wrong. Shame says, I am wrong. The first teaches, the second destroys. I learned to separate them, to see mistakes as information, not identity. And the fifth truth, I don't need permission to start over. That one broke something open inside me. I had spent so long waiting for someone to tell me it was okay to change. But no one was coming. There's no stamp of approval for rebirth. The permission slip you've been waiting for has always been in your own hands. Each of these truths reshaped how I saw myself. Together, they became a quiet philosophy, not stoicism written in marble, but stoicism lived in small, daily choices. To think better, to speak kinder, to act with awareness. Because wisdom isn't a destination, it's a practice. Rebirth doesn't come in lightning, it comes in whispers. It's the quiet decision to stop carrying what's killing you. One evening, I realized that my life was not something happening to me. It was something I was constantly recreating through thought, choice, and belief. I had been waiting for a sign, a miracle, a reset. But life had already given me the materials. What I lacked was courage. So I started small. I stopped apologizing for outgrowing things, friendships, habits, even dreams that no longer felt like mine. It felt like betrayal at first, but growth always feels like that, because you're betraying the version of you that was willing to settle. Every act of letting go was an act of faith, a quiet trust that what's meant for me will recognize me when I'm ready. I learned that rebirth is cyclical. It happens again and again, each time you confront an old wound with new awareness. Each time you choose not to react the way you once did. You don't become someone new. You remember who you were before fear rewrote your story. For a long time, I thought healing meant never hurting again. But it doesn't. Healing means understanding that the pain once served a purpose, and that purpose has now been fulfilled. You don't curse the fire that forged you. You thank it for the heat that taught you your own strength. When I finally looked in the mirror and saw not a project to fix but a soul to protect, I understood. The journey was never about becoming perfect. It was about becoming whole. There's a moment when peace stops feeling like a dream and starts feeling like home. You stop craving validation, not because you've become indifferent, but because you've remembered your worth doesn't depend on being seen. That's mastery, not control over the world, but over your own reactions to it. For years, I thought mastery meant dominance. to win arguments, to bend circumstances to my will. But true mastery is gentler. It's the art of remaining centered when everything pulls you off balance. It's the ability to pause between impulse and action, and to choose wisdom instead of ego. Life will never stop testing you. The difference now is that I no longer see challenges as punishments, but as invitations. Opportunities to practice calm in chaos, clarity in confusion, and kindness in conflict. Marcus Aurelius said, "The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way. The obstacle doesn't block your path. It is the path." The more I practice this, the more I see that mastery isn't an achievement. It's a relationship between awareness and action, between discipline and compassion. It's not about rising above emotion. It's about walking beside it without drowning. I still fail, still falter, still forget. But each time I return faster. Each time I meet myself with more grace. That, too, is mastery, not perfection, but consistency. And one day, you wake up and realize the war is still there, but it no longer owns you. The voice in your head still whispers, but it no longer commands. You are no longer chasing peace. You have become it. That is where the journey ends, and where it always begins again.